Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 453. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast, a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on the Evergreen Network, please visit evergreenpodcast.com. This week's interview is with Dr. Naeema Pasha. Naeema is Director of Careers and Professional Development at Henley Business School. She's won multiple awards in professional development and speaks extensively on side hustling, flexible working, and the gig economy. In this conversation with Naeema, we discuss her new book, Futureproof Your Career, How to Lead and Succeed in a Changing World. We look at her work on career resilience, how leaders need to mix science and empathy, fitting in versus belonging, and pluralistic leadership. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. Please do consider to drop in your rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the show with Naeema. Dr. Naeema Pasha, it's great to have you on my show. Director of Careers and Professional Development at the Henley Business School, founder of the World of Work, an annual conference on the future of work. And you were named as one of the IFPC-online top 50 worldwide influencers on AI ethics in 2020. Congratulations for that. And of course, the reason why I got you on my show is that you have just published a book with Dr. Shaheena Janjuha-Jivraj, Futureproof Your Career. In your own words, how would you like to describe yourself?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, so I'm Dr. Naeema Passion, just as you said, working at Henley Business School, and I've just given a talk actually, and I describe myself because yes, I've set up a career and professional development service. I've set up the World of Work. I'm also director of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and I've also started this brand new campaign on staff engagement and so on. So, and I thought that's a lot to talk about, all these different job areas. So I've kind of pulled it into one thing. And I said, essentially what I'm really interested in is human skilling, which sounds a bit harsh, but it's in a sense who we are, how we develop, and what we can do to evolve and lead the kind of lives that we want to lead, which are both economically satisfactory, as well as all the other kind of things that we want from a psychological well-being state as well. So yeah, that's what I'd say. That's me.
Lovely. So would you then say that that's your purpose, your personal purpose, human skilling?
Yes, I would. There's a slight hesitation there because I was telling somebody in the team that this is what I want to do, and I think this is what I want. What I've put my name up against. This is, if there's a placard, I'd be writing that on it to say this is what I do. The kind of hesitancy is that as soon as something goes into the corporate space, it becomes very exciting, and then it's got a life cycle of becoming naff after a while. So now we're going into purpose as being, I think we're heading towards a tipping point where it starts becoming less authentic. So yeah, that is my purpose, but you know, at the moment I hope it sounds fairly authentic.
So you in your doctoral thesis you wrote about a study of career resilience. So brazen though this question might be, what was the main thesis of your thesis as far as gathering that resilience?
Sure. Well, my doctorate research covered essentially how we look at working through a world that's non-linear, perhaps that we think is quite linear in terms of career path because of ideas that we've developed from the second industrial revolution, third revolution to some extent. So as part of that, I was looking at different ideas around that, how we manage change, the kind of orientation to change, the orientation to the future work with the impact of AI. And a piece within that, I also looked at career resilience, and I developed a scale around that to look at those people, look at a comparison group of those people that had higher career resilience and those that had less career resilience. And if I can tell you the headline finding of that, there was 5 different factors. I don't want to go all the academic in this, but 5 different factors. But the factor that really came out most strong in terms of looking at the data were those people that had higher what I've looked at called self-reliance. Essentially, when we think we can do something, when we feel that we've got we've got a place, we've got an internal locus of control, we're more likely to have higher self-reliance and therefore able to propel us forward to achieve our goals and manage the changes around us.
Well, that's interesting then. So you say resilience is about self-reliance. You also, as I understood it within the book, talk about it as being self-aware as well. With these,
yeah yes so there's 5 different factors around the thing I looked at. So there's different understanding yourself, as you talked about, self-awareness. So those people that have positive self-concept is one of the factors around my career resilience scale. So those people who are self-aware, who understand their own strengths, their skills, perhaps even their personality, and do some reflective understanding of who they are, what they stand for, what they believe in, and feel confident within that. Now, you just really happy to be here, by the way. I don't think if I said that at the beginning. I'm really happy to be here. And I've just raced back from giving a talk to the Black and Ethnic Minority group at the University of Reading, where we're working, about some of the ideas that have come through. And I talked about positive self-concept. I talked about self-reliance, and to include the element of equity and diversity in this. It's actually, and I talked about this then, it's easier if you've grown up with a sense of, if you've grown up where you haven't had to face as many challenges, perhaps if you had high levels of privilege. Everybody faces difficulty in life, not to disclude that at all, and everybody has challenges, but there are groups of people that are more likely to experience discrimination and so on. So in that environment, one of the things that's harder to do is to achieve self-reliance, positive self-concept, and that's what I was really talking about with this group, is how you can go in to yourself and think about, do some reflective practice and really kind of build on that ability to think, you can make change, you can move forward, you can reskill, you can do all those kind of things.
That's interesting. Clearly I have more privilege within me in so many different ways. And yet the thing that I tend to zero in on is actually the ability to accept one's imperfections, as opposed to positivizing what they are. It's more just an embracing of our fuller, imperfect selves that I tend to focus on. And perhaps that's because I see too many leaders with a little sense of entitlement or lack of self-awareness. So I kind of feel like they need to pull down a little bit and accept that they don't know everything, accept that they need to learn, rely on others, ask questions, and be aware that sometimes they're absolutely raving assholes for the way that they operate, because they're not aware of the chips on their shoulders.
So I still like a child when somebody swears. I'm still like laughing.
I don't do it so often.
I would like myself to feel more comfortable with my imperfections, and the book really goes into a little bit more about future-proofing, understanding your areas of imperfection, having not perhaps following a hubristic style of leadership and being more empathetic. That's certainly clear. One of the things I've talked about here is particularly as I've just talked about, is that for those groups of people who have continually perhaps been held back and in the workplace, we've got to perhaps look at an additional way of, yes, understand your imperfections, but also understand that sometimes why you're withheld from growth and development is because of the structural systems around you, and how you don't have to beat yourself up all the time, but perhaps look at different ways. Just even take your foot off the gas for a little while, because it's hard work. Kind of, being an activist, for example, during the workplace is exhausting. It's got a mental effect. It could even impact your career as well. So anyway, that's what I talked about. So I think there's a balance in terms of how we move forward on, developing that side of ourselves in the workplace.
There's no doubt that there's a fatigue coming with leadership, and the responsibility that comes with it. And if you're acting out of hubris and bravado and not in touch with who you are, I think that disconnection causes you to use an extra amount of energy to compensate for this appearance that you're proposing rather than the real authentic self you could be proposing.
I love that, and I love the work that you've done on this as well, actually. So I really, can really relate to what you're talking about in terms of empathetic leadership, connected leadership. People just, give a damn about the staff, the environment, the stakeholders, and I know perhaps organisations are moving towards that, or at least making suggestions around that. And obviously working at a business school, how people are looking at something like ESG, environmental, social, governance kind of investment and so on, is enabling people to perhaps think more differently. I wanted to say, however, I also was lead researcher this summer on something called, we call the equity effect at Henley Business School, major piece of research on race equity in the workplace. And it was picked up by the Bank of England. The governor quoted it. It was
nice.
Super. Yeah, I fell off my chair when I saw that. It was in the Guardian. I was like, oh my God. That's it. I can retire now. But it was really, it was a great piece. I say that myself, but it was really proud to have led that research and pulling a whole range of things together. There's complexities around. I think probably what we've got is two tracks of leadership. I'm just going to say, and this probably links to skilling as well. That we've got a group of leaders that have come through from a track. I remember when universities, employers used to go to universities and they'll say, you must have this many kind of entry grades. You must have been, to join our graduate track, you must have been captain of the football club, treasurer of the hockey club. You should have gone, traversed the Andes with nothing but a tin of Spam in your summer holiday. And this kind of,
read the entire works of Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, rode the Atlantic, so on and so forth, and so that's what we and it wasn't that long ago, you had to have this kind of academic attainment and so on, to join the banks and professional firms and so on and so forth. So this was recruitment through the 80s. In the 70s, perhaps you got, you're tapped on the shoulder. So you've got a group of leaders in the 90s as well moving forward. It's only in the last few years that employers are thinking, actually, hold on a second. We're just looking at our stakeholders. We're looking at our customers and we realize, God damn it, they're from completely different backgrounds. We've got to relate to them. We've got to understand. And certainly things like the murder of George Floyd that we saw last summer, sparking the Black Lives Matter movement, and Pride, Me Too, a whole range of different things that we're looking at, how people respond differently to workplaces. So anyway, come back to my research this summer, is what I found actually through this research is that when employers, and I looked at correlation research and looked at the FTSE 350 firms, when employers, and I hope this will you'll relate to this, is that when they invested in their organisation into race equity, and when we looked at correlation figures, 58% increase in revenue than those that didn't. But if you look deeper behind the figures, and they were from all sorts of FTSE 350 firms and from different industries and backgrounds, so it was, as broad as I could get. What we also found is that there was and this is, I hope, what we will relate to, they also, because they were investing in race equity, the organisation and cultural mindset was about, employees come to work, the more you value them, the more you understand them, the more you sort of enable them to do their best, you're going to start feeding innovation. Innovation will feed productivity. Productivity should feed growth. So they also had better employee well-being. They also, interestingly, had better orientation towards climate, environmental, and a whole range of other things. So we found that as well. But we did still find a large portion, about 30% of people still witnessing inequity in their organisation, and race was the biggest one. And through that was things like verbal abuse, lack of promotion, and so on. So while we're getting those people, going back to those people that have come through from the 70s and 80s through that particular route, they came from privileged backgrounds. What we're looking at now is people coming through from different backgrounds, trying to get into organisations who have different skill set and different things to offer, and perhaps can offer something to that hubristic leadership that we probably see a little bit too much of.
In terms of different profiles, I obviously So many cultures will promote and think more highly of people with mathematical or scientific or engineering backgrounds, highly rational. Do you see any research showing that having humanities, anthropologists, sociologists, literary folk could be better adapted, better equipped to deal with this type of world and leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. There is, I'm going to say something slightly aside from that, if I may. And I think in the sense that we do see, there is evidence to show that people from study humanities and art can obviously offer philosophy. I work with lots of AI firms. They kept saying, we need to hire a chief philosophy officer. We need get the philosophers in. It was all the philosophers. And so we could say, let's go to this group of people who studied these qualities, these degree programs, philosophy, arts, humanities, and not science, or we get the scientists because we need this. Or, and I think this is the kind of things that you've often talked about in your, when you sort of develop your kind of ethical framework in organizations, the things that you say. Or we could work with people that they have those, they could come through from a physics or maths or computing, but they also have ethical understanding, philosophical understanding. And also, because obviously working in university, for people who are studying English literature and history and things. So that's fantastic because you're developing your creative and reflective practice. But what if you also did a coding course as well, just to understand the kind of requirements there are? So we could start saying that these are critical skills that we need, the human skilling thing I talked about. So everybody, to some extent, understanding, leaving university, emerging leaders, mid leaders, which is what the book is really looking at particularly, is developing both that kind of digital and AI skill set, but also those human qualities that we're always hearing about, but really going into a little bit more about that. And part of that, if I link to the work that you've done, is looking at how we start looking at this ethical framework, understanding how that contextually sits to where we want to go. An ethical framework, I'd say, part of that must include looking at diversity, inclusion, and equitable outcomes for all staff, for all and stakeholders and customers and all the rest of them.
One of the ways you describe the skills that the future leader needs, this mid-level and up leader, is a combination of science and empathy. So it feels like that very much resonates with this idea of knowing how to deal with data and also with people. Yet, it's true that logical people are usually less good at empathy. So it's a hard mix to come. Is it not some kind of five-footed horse that we're looking for?
Yeah, obviously you go out there and look for this unicorn, the five-footed horse, for people who have all those qualities. But we can all have these qualities in different levels, is one thing I can say, is that we could, and we can't be something that we're not, but we can all have an appreciation for other things. But you can build teams together. When I started working in the area of AI, and I'm not an AI technologist, I'm really looking at the skilling and kind of where we're moving forward. But what I found was and I'm sure you have this, the technology team was sitting over somewhere or other, working on something or other. And then the HR team is somewhere else. Just take those two, move away from senior leaders and marketing and finance or something. But just those two, for example, are quite separated. And when I started trying to talk to these two teams to come together and try and work together on more collaborative ways, so we don't present something right at the end, like an employee engagement tool using AI without, that is presented and it looks really odd because it's not got all the things that HR are looking for. And also those people need to come together a lot more in organizations. And that's a little bit what we're saying about the degree qualifications, that if we just go for the philosopher to come in or the computer scientist to come in, we're going to create these sort of pillars that are separate rather than kind of a pool of people that can work more collaboratively together. That's what I think.
So you write in the book, leadership is a result of behavior and attitudes rather than being specifically linked to formal appointments or titles. As I read that, that's sort of how I described company culture, a question of behavior, language, and attitudes. So I conclude then that leadership is really the same as culture somehow.
Yeah, this is what it's interesting working in a business school. All business schools are focused on leadership. And the dean at Henley will talk about what we need. We need to focus on leadership or management. And he said what we want is we don't mind accidental managers or accidental leaders, because they can be quite good because they've been plunged into something, develop skill sets, and develop. What we've got to be careful in UK business is amateur level leadership and management, and that's where business schools come in. And business schools, when we're addressing leadership, have to look at culture at the same time, organizational culture, organizational climate, and how us as individuals and leaders, what we're talking about there is people coming out of university or emerging leaders, they're developing their leadership skill set, and that all the way up to your CEO characters as well. But yeah, it's very much linked to culture. I don't think we can separate leadership away from culture.
For having led several businesses, I think of the decision-making process and the arguments and brainstorming that goes into the final product at some level. Inevitably, there's a time constraint, and there has to be a decision that is made, and you are held responsible for that as the head of the business. So a leader has that ultimate responsibility. When we talk about having different points of view, that takes time to sift through. And not only does it take the skill let's say, to tease out the person who's being quiet in the group, or the allowing the space for the person who doesn't feel that they have the authority or the right to speak. There's also a real issue when it comes to the ability to listen to everybody, of the time squeeze. And so I was wondering, how does one create not just the mindset, but the time for all this? Because a lot of people I know are working 14-hour days, and I feel at the end of the day, they're rushing towards a burnout at this point because of the attempts and the needs to address all these different ESG type issues in the workplace. At the end of the day, we still have to be an ongoing concern.
Of course, an ongoing concern, because we want to do the right thing, we want to deliver to customers, we want to do all the economy and all the rest of it. I agree. This is complex. You asked me a question that I'm kind of like, I struggle with myself as managing a team myself, working in Henley's senior team as well. So on the one hand, saying we need less hubristic leadership, because hubristic leadership can lead to shorter time scales. Yeah. It can be like, we're doing it this way.
Exactly. And I'm going to tell you the way it is.
Sometimes I desire that when sometimes I'd like to be like that more. Sometimes I desire that myself, to just tell me what I don't want to have to do some reflective exercise to work out where we put the flip chart away, and let me, give that answer. But what I found myself, and I'm going to talk anecdotally because the research on this I think is supportive, is that two things I can go to. One of them is the 4-day week that we've looked at in Henley. That's the first, just to mention that first of all. And what we found, and there's other pieces of research, but this is quite a good piece, quite an in-depth piece of research was involved in as well, is that when we start looking at how we can create efficiencies in the workplace, and what we looked at was a compressed 4-day week. We didn't look at chopping your work off. It was like compression, stay at the work. And we looked at the research, we looked at organizations that did it. That what we found was really interesting is that the organizations that adopted it did have greater productivity. They found greater efficiencies. There were reduced meetings. Those 14-hour day meetings were reduced because you just thought, no, I can't do that. There's no way I can fit it in. We'll have to find another way, put something else on, or I'm not doing it. No, this isn't happening. So, but the productivity increased. What we also found in that is that stress reduced, well-being increased, and productivity, and also quality increased as well. So if we kind of pull some things out of that in relation to time, because literally it was around time, is viewing our work differently and looking at things that we need to say, absolutely, this isn't possible. So it's probably being a little bit more, as we talked about at the beginning, to be a bit more, this isn't going to happen. We're definitely focusing on this. This is really critical to where we're going. And for leaders it's the hardest thing in leadership is to make decisions, to look at the kind of decision processes of where we need to go next. That is the toughest thing. And then the processes behind it. So being quite harsh on that. I think you've probably come across Professor Alex Edmonds at London Business School, who talks a lot about ESG, and his book on the Eat the Pie, something about pies, about how we can do more. And he actually says, look, we are businesses. We've got, we want to improve our pension pot and things like this. We are businesses, but we have to be discerning. Perhaps our main thing we'll look for in terms of ESG is environment. Maybe the main thing we look at is our work with our employee well-being, or maybe it's part of device. We don't lose the other things, but maybe we need to start focusing a lot more, because we can't be everything to everyone. So that's the main thing I wanted to say, that we're pulling things out from that data, that we create efficiencies, and then also, which was the most interesting thing, well-being increased and quality alongside productivity. Yeah. There was something else I was going to add, but I forgot. So.
There's clearly a good amount of research that warrants, from a mathematical standpoint, it shows performance, and yet the dial doesn't seem to be moving too fast. So these arguments don't seem to muster the changes that are needed behind it.
No, and I looked at that as well, so thinking, well, this kind of makes sense. We developed the 5-day working week through the second industrial revolution, through mechanization, people going into factories, and I think it was Henry Ford, the Ford factory unions that argued for having 2 days off, and then voila, the weekend finally appeared. So we're stuck to this model for 100 years and beyond. Forget when it was, but it's about 100 years ago. So so we've stuck to that. And what happened, it's not just organizations that have stuck to that, or businesses, it's hospitals, it's schools, it's retail, it's everything that we live and work around. I'll work around this particular construct of a 5-day week, 2-day weekend, other countries, our suppliers and things. So if we wanted to move to something like a 4-day week, personally, I'm a fan, having especially looked at the research, and I've tried to kind of adopt that myself a little bit. And I found it's just a day to no meetings. Do not put meetings in this day. This is when I'm doing other stuff. And then it's actually worked well for me. The thing that's going to stop it is that you've got to go and pick your kids up from school because they're on a 5-day. You need your GP open on Sunday. So we've got to look at the whole, this is why it's so difficult, infrastructure of society. And it's probably why we need to work in partnership more closely with governments and our own government as well, to look at how this might progress. But I have seen some signs in the UK government, to look at something like the 4-day week as a possibility, because of the pandemic and how our work patterns have changed.
Yeah,
since.
I've certainly talked about and implemented a rigorous notion of time. And one of the things that I was keen to do was make sure that I allowed the time for the messiness of life. And in that time allocation was also time to think strategically, and to take care of the things that I need to do that might be outside of work, like go to see a doctor, because the doctor works 9 to 5 and such like. So that if I were back to back with meetings, I have no time for the accidental chat where someone rushes into the open door and say, "Hey, Minter, I need to speak to you," or the time to prepare properly meetings, as opposed to just rushing from one to the other. So I think time is such an important element.
Minter, I completely agree with you. And again, that's what I've looked at myself, and just that piece of research is that the well-being and the productivity. I mean, Microsoft's research that they did on our kind of a reaction to a lot of online video meetings was interesting to say. Not only are we slightly freaked out by looking at each other on screens because it's a bit looming. I don't know if you've been into hybrid offices yet, when you've got some people or a person that's looming in and they look like an all-seeing Sauron god looking over you.
Big Brother.
So yeah, it's quite. I've been one of those people. I'm thinking, I feel very awkward, this kind of person looming out. So we're reacting, our eyes, our brains, from the psychological and physiological side of things is changing. But also the research, as you just said, is that our conscientiousness, our desire to do well, our desire not to be judged for not doing well, those intrinsic drivers that we have will make us go to the next meeting, will make us accept the next Zoom and the next Teams meeting, will make us, in that hybrid, more complicated how we work that, do that extra report, do the extra. And again, this is the talk I was talking about to the Black and ethnic minority group as well, where people from more marginalised group are even more likely to say, yes, I'll do that, in order to look like they're doing well. So the protection of space is something really critical that you said, because you've got to go to the GP or you go and buy a present for a friend or whatever it is, or
pick up a kid.
Don't know, pick up a kid. Exactly. So that I think is something really important, and it can link back, because your question was about decision making and leadership. It can enable better leadership. That's my big statement.
So I wanted to go into picking up on what you just talked about, a phrase that Brene Brown wrote about the idea or the difference between fitting in and belonging. And I think it seems quite appropriate in this context. She wrote, fitting in is about assessing a situation and becoming who you need to be accepted. Belonging, on the other hand, doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires to be who we are. And I was wondering to what extent that is a realistic framework, especially in context of diversity and inclusion. Is the onus only on the receiving end to make everyone feel like they belong? And then how do you frame the need to fit in? Because you could go immigration into a country with the same type of conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Really lovely question, actually. I'm really about to launch into a passionate speech now, because I feel quite strongly about this. So first of all, I was talking to the same colleague I mentioned yesterday about where I'm working, and somebody was really cynical that we can't really move forward. What is the point? I mean, we've known about racism at least the last 400 years. We've experienced really horrific things in society, from genocide and all kinds of things that we've as a society we know. So can we really shift the dial? And I want to say I want to shift the dial a little bit, that kind of Steve Jobs statement to put a tiny dent in the universe, or whatever it is. So yes, we can, the first thing. So I might be deluded, but I'm going to go with it. I think we can make some changes, and I think we've already had some changes already. Belonging and fitting in are quite interesting, and I think I'm going to go back to the idea of privilege again. So I have straight privilege. I'm a straight woman. And for me, I've never had to think twice about my sexual orientation in the workplace and think, can I disclose things? I can be quite open. I never had that experience of thinking, will I get judged literally for who I love? For literally the kind of relationships I want? Will people start making snide comments about me? Will people start making really funny jokes, or I have to see all those kind of things, or not accepted by my family? That kind of impact of not fitting in, of not belonging and being accepted, can have such a psychological impact, which can affect mental and then physical health. So I think it's quite a critical thing to know that you can belong for who you are, and you obviously, as you say, you can go quite far with this. But if we look at what I'm working on, the Equalities Act, and looking at people who are broadly discriminated against, for those people, for that group of people, yes, we've got to work harder for organisations to look at how they can make things feel comfortable, that you can go to work for who you are and not have that burden of hiding who you are. It's not even that long ago in the UK, we talk about other countries, but not even that long ago in the UK, for example, it would be illegal to be gay, and carrying that burden of shame and so on, to think that you've got to go into the workplace and feel ashamed of who you are. I'm able-bodied as well, so I don't have to go to work and think, am I going to get to the toilets okay if I've got physical disability? Is there a toilet I could use? Are there stairs I can get to that meeting? Will the slides be available beforehand so I can have because they're not in a way that I can do? That's kind of basic stuff that, as a privilege, my privilege, that I don't think about in terms of going into work, that I have a sense of belonging. I can go and wander into Henley Business School and I know nobody's going to question me on those things at all. And I can find my way to a lecture theatre or go and get myself a coffee or something. I don't have to think so far ahead about belonging. So that's the kind of things in terms of fitting in. Of course, we can put a ramp in and things like this. But if we created workplaces, particularly for where we've got specific groups of people who are marginalised, discriminated against, discriminated against, that we should, they need to feel better about, feel more sense of belonging.
I guess my question, Naeema, is about the need to fit in, because I tend to believe that if I'm welcomed into a house, I need to comply to the household's customs and habits, take off my shoes if that is the way it is, and eat the food that I'm served because that's what they prepared. So at that level, I'm fitting in. And it feels like that's not what people are looking for when it comes to a job. It's like you need to accommodate everything about me. I prefer to wear shoes. I want meat, not vegetarian, or whatever is being served. And so I wonder about this gap between fitting in and belonging.
This is quite well. I'm really glad you talked about this. So we've got it's quite well prescribed in the legislation. It's quite well prescribed in organizational culture. It's fitting in so you're not discriminated against. So if you went to someone's house and you don't, and then they invited you there, or you got there, and they make you feel incredibly unwelcome. They make all the food that you can't eat, and you've gone along. You've taken off your shoes or not taken off your shoes, whichever one it is, in the house. And then you're sick on the way home because the food didn't agree with you, then you've really had a horrible time. And that, in a weird way, that's what happens in some organizations that came through from the equity effect, that some people, we've still got 30% of people getting verbal abuse for what race they are in their organization. So we're not getting of people who experience racism, by the way. So what I'm saying is not it's at the core side of anti-discrimination that we need to look at first, rather than say, oh, let's all get on, because we should all bring variance and difference and we should all respect different cultures. And we're always going to have difficulties where we on the borders of those things. If you and I were friends, well, hopefully we are friends now, we'll find things that, as any group of friends will have, well, that feels uncomfortable to me, that feels fine to me.
Yeah, I think the challenge we have is allowing for debate, argument, the diversity of opinions and mindsets, without it becoming, well, you just told me that because you're a woman, or you're just saying that because, or making it part of the identity of the other and getting meta on the conversation, as opposed to sticking with the confines of, oh, I disagree with you, vehemently, Naeema, because this is my opinion. These are the facts. And you're just, but don't speak to me like that. And how to avoid that situation, because frankly, I've done many different types of environments, and you can either be polite, in which case people don't really express themselves, or you can go all out like the French are very much, voluble and saying everything and saying swear words. And you could take that personally, especially if you're not used to the culture. So How does one create that environment and also really have success and, efficient productivity, et cetera, that you were talking about before?
Sure. Well, there's two things. First thing was around if we're looking at in the workplace and looking for productivity. You just said talk about productivity, and I'm really obviously a big fan of your work and looking at your work when you worked at L'Oreal as well, and looking what L'Oreal has done in terms of. I'm like, wow, what have they done in terms of not just looking at the product range, but it's supporting Indigenous women, for example, in how in terms of like self-development and so on. And it's all around beauty. It's all around beauty, cosmetics, something I'm interested in, and that if you've got your end goal about productivity and outcome about, I don't know what the purpose or mission might be, but bringing beauty to every gender that wants to wear them, women, men, people who are binary, whatever it is, if it's something about that, making them feel good, maybe it's something like that, then if that's your purpose, then you will know that diversity is going to be critical to your business goals. So bringing people around the table, kick your shoes off, don't kick your shoes off. Let's have a discussion where we try not to get polarized, because we've got this end goal that we want to support these people, and that's the value side of things. And I myself, and I completely agree with you, it's difficult, and I have this debate. So I've got my stance in this on how I want to look at diversity inclusion, and my one is equity. My focus is on equity in the workplace, and I'm taking it. And I'm quite strong on it, that it's a business outcome. And that's why the equity effect was looked at the business effect of discrimination and all the rest of it. So, and this sounds to you like, well, that seems quite sensible. But when I'm working with people who, or coming across people from social justice backgrounds, psychological backgrounds, educational backgrounds in the space of D&I or D&I specialists, some find it, they've talked about a dehumanizing, because business shouldn't be, we should be doing the right thing because it's human talking the language you say. So I'm saying, no, this is business, because business is people, it's community, as we know. So that's the approach around equity. The other aspect of it, if we are going to, as we've experienced across the world and Brexit and so on, if we're not able to talk collectively, we've got to look at the language you use. So the language I'm using in my equity practice, and again, I get into, I create challenges for people, because I don't want to use words like white fragility, or I can't remember you can't even get them through, just because there are connotations, there's anger. So if we want
masculinity would be another one, surely.
Toxic masculinity, there you go. So these if we want to, especially in business, want to create that goal back when you're at L'Oreal, to get all these people to we want to do this particular aim. If we're using this kind of language, it's like if we're looking at AI adoption, if we use very kind of aggressive language around it, language that separates people off, we're not going to progress. So I think that's part of, you're absolutely right, we have to create a different language, the kind of things you talked about in terms of empathetic leadership, which is really about connection and understanding, from what I've taken from what you write about and talk about.
So yeah. Dr. Naeema Pasha, with a name like that, as we spoke offline, there's a Southern Indian root passing through Persia with a Pasha. I also have had several Indian guests on my show. And in 2015, I saw research that showed that 30% of Fortune 500 companies have Indians as their CEOs. Of course, there are over 1 billion Indians in the world, so you might say that's close to representative, yet it still is a higher index than the Indian populations in UK, United States, where the majority of the Fortune 500 companies come from. So in this leads me to believe that there's something going on, whether it's with Microsoft or Google or Pepsi with Indra Nooyi. There's something going on about the Indian gestalt, the Indian way, that is leading them to be more accepted, maybe, or better leaders. What do you think about that, Dr. Naeema Pasha?
Thank you very much. Yes, South Indian. I'm still waiting to run my, trillion dollar AI company based on my ethnicity. So there's a few. You did ask me about this, and it's something I've thought about a lot myself. Coming up again, more and more people from this the same diaspora that I'm from, and I think there's different elements to it. One of the elements is the absolute emphasis on education. It's part of the psychology of many Asian countries, African countries as well. Education, you have to do well. There is a negative side to this as well. So whilst we're going, this is great, but the focus on achieving educationally is really strong. So we may not see that many Olympians, for example, in from India, Pakistan, other places, is because there's such a strong emphasis on academic achievement. And many of the organizations that we're looking at, that people have done very well academically. These CEOs have done very well academically. They've done well academically in India, then they'll go off to a US or a London Business School or something. Even Rishi Sunak, that we've got as the Chancellor, did extremely well. So academic achievement is really part of the Indian psyche. It's even part of some of the religion, in the Hindu religion and Islamic religion as well, really pushing education really high. So that's one of the things. And then the other thing is this: you talked about the kind of qualities about succeeding, about the connection to community, the ethical practices around trying to do well and to do good, where we see, I think it's now the new CEO of Barclays is South Indian background as well, just taken over from the person that was asked to step down. We'll go into that a bit more. But yeah, and was chosen, I was reading the piece on why it's chosen, it's that South Indian, they're talking about kind of humbleness, very bright, committed to employees, really kind of lack of hubristic leadership. I don't know, that's anecdotal observations.
Yeah,
not...
I certainly feel that there's something in there, and it links into this last question I want to ask you, Naeema, which is around pluralism. You pushed back, if you will, the way I read it anyway, about inclusion, the D and the I. You say it shouldn't be about inclusion, which means to enclose, which doesn't sound like a good place to be, but rather you would focus on pluralistic leadership. And within that, it leads me to think that India is a little bit more of a pluralistic country. And I was wondering if that was not a link, but in any event, in some few words, can you tell us why pluralistic or pluralism is a skill that leaders need to have to future-proof their careers?
Well, in terms of India, it's such a vast country, because, and also politically, it's changing as well. So I'll really go into it in detail, because we've got, and every organization will have cultures, traditions, ethics, religions that will create things, and we've got political, perhaps a climate that's perhaps not entirely the same as well. So one of the things organizations definitely we look at is around pluralistic approaches. And it's not, I talked about D&I, and people come from different ethnicities and all the rest of it, but there's also just different ways of thinking, and how the bias, cognitive biases, cognitive differences that we need to bring in. People from, in the UK, we've still got divides from north and south of the UK, and that's similar to many other countries as well. And it's how you can start looking at where we need cultural differences and differences that coming together. If we don't have that, and there's some really good research in Henley that shows that when you get diversity, from all kinds of diversity, those teams perform better, but they don't perform better straight away. So what sometimes we have, the pain of diversity, the pain of pluralism coming in, where we've got different kind of, or people come from different backgrounds, can feel difficult. You'll come around to dinner and people like, take off your shoes, don't take off your shoes, that kind of painful conversations that you have to begin with. Once you go through that, you outperform. That's what the research really particularly showed. So it's really being able to focus a lot more on difference and what the contribution difference, and this is where leadership comes into its own. this is where people do need to take a steer. I know you talk a lot about empathetic leaders, non-hubristic leaders, but that doesn't mean a leader that doesn't take responsibility for meeting the challenges moving forward. They can't always go around with a flip chart. And what do you guys think? They've got to, they've got to go in and say, this is where we're going. Cultural pluralism, for example, that we're looking at differences in our team and our organizations. And I'm going to take the stick for the first stage of this working. I'm going to accept failure. I'm going to keep going with it until I get the results. If it doesn't work, start again.
I love it. Well, I think that in the end of the day, it's a journey, and it does take hard work, conscientiousness. It also means having the courage sometimes to just make a decision, even if it pisses people off. And it can't be just an easy road. I think to say it would be an easy road would be to misunderstand business in general. And I think it's a whole learning that we have ahead of us. Dr. Naeema Pasha, how can someone track you down or follow you? And of course, how can they get your book from Bloomsbury Business Press?
Oh, thank you. Yes, of course, the book is called Futureproof Your Career, How to Lead and Succeed in a Changing World, available in all good bookshops. So it's also on Amazon and WH Smith and Waterstones. I'm Director of EDI and World of Work and so on at Henley Business School. So you can always contact me there, and on LinkedIn, and I'm on Twitter. Ignore a lot of my Twitter.
Fabulous, Naeema. Thank you for coming on the show.
It's been such a pleasure and such an honor to meet you as well. Thank you.
Thanks for having listened to this episode of the Minter Dialogue podcast. If you like the show and would like to support me, please consider a donation on patreon.com/MinterDial. You can also subscribe on your favorite podcast service. And as ever, rating and reviews are the real currency for podcasts. You'll find the show notes with over 2,000 and more blog posts on minterdial.com. Check out my documentary film and 4 books, including my last one, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
A stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust is the reason. Still I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man, building an urge. I'm a convinced man, to live and die submerged. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle with deceit. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust in my reason, and let me show you why. I'm a convinced man, practicing my lines. I'm a convinced man, here in these confines. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, admit to the test. I'm a convinced man, I'm ready for an arrest. I'm a convinced man, in the arms of a woman.